Hello, friends. Good evening. I am happy to be here with you tonight and to welcome and to introduce a dear friend of mine. Although I don't know if you remember where we met. Do you, Gareth? I do not remember where we met. I do not remember where we saw each other last, but all of a sudden, we just picking up the conversation when we left off. That is, that's a great gift. Let us begin with a land acknowledgement. St. Mark Cathedral acknowledges that we gather on the traditional land of the people of Seattle, the Duwamish people who are still here, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the life of all Coast Salish tribes. I'm happy to introduce to you Gareth Higgins. As I mentioned, is a dear friend whom I know to be a great storyteller, someone with feet planted, rooted on the ground, and yet the capacity to dream and to imagine and to invite those of us into that sacred space of imagination. Gareth Higgins was born in Belfast in 1975, grew up during the Northern Ireland Troubles, and now lived in the US. He writes and speaks about the power of storytelling to shape our lives in the world, peace and making justice, and how to take life seriously without believing your own propaganda. He has been involved in peace building and violence reduction in Northern Ireland and helping address the legacy of conflict. Received a PhD in sociology from Queen's University in Belfast and helped reach the world's first graduate course in reconciliation studies in Trinity College, Dublin. He also helped found the Wild Goose Festival here in the US, News Stories and Movies and Meaning Festivals. And Gareth leads retreats in North America and Ireland, and he founded The Porch magazine. And before we have Gareth come over and share with us stories, let us pray. Blessed One, we know so many stories about ourselves, some of them the same stories we tell about others. Beautiful, ugly, simple, difficult, joyous, useful, worthless. Stories about who we are, what we know, and the potentials and impossibilities of our future. Stories about our purpose and the meaning of our lives. We have countless stories buried too deep in our souls for us to even recognize them. God of discovery, help us find the strength to excavate those buried stories. Let us lean on one another as we brush them off, hold them to the light, and find their meaning and use. May our roots nourish us so that we may grow abundantly and flower into blessing for one another and the world. Amen. Please help me welcome Gareth Higgins.
Thank you, Eliasine. Thank you, everybody. This is a real person here. Just as I'm assuming all of you are, I don't know all of you, but I do know Eliasine, and we've kind of woven in and out of each other's lives over probably 15 years or more. And one of the signs, I think, that there's a consciousness larger than the individual is when you bump into someone and you pick up where you left off and you find each other again. And we got to do that this afternoon for a couple of hours. It was very touching to me. And I appreciate the invitation to be here. Where's Wendy? At the back. Thank you, Wendy, for welcoming me here at the community at the Cathedral. A while back, I woke up screaming from a nightmare, and in the nightmare, I was being, you're gonna laugh when I say this, but trust me, it wasn't funny at the time, but it's okay to laugh if you find it funny now. In the nightmare, I was being chased down the street by a naked Alfred Hitchcock who was trying to catch up with me and kill me. You know, I think lots of us have had nightmares where somebody's trying to kill us. And I woke up screaming, and Brian, who I share life with, was pushing on my back to wake me up because he could hear me. And I sleep with a CPAP mask, and screaming through a CPAP mask makes you sound like an even more, or makes you look like an even more disturbed Hannibal Lecter. Brian woke me up and said, "You're okay. You're okay. You have what you need." And then he rolled over and went straight back to sleep and had no memory of this the next morning. Tell me if this makes any difference to the if I'm the only person hearing tinniness. You have what you need. If there's something undergirding what I want to share with you tonight, it's that. You have what you need. And our culture tells us that you don't. Lots of our culture, lots of the dominant stories in our society tell us that you don't have what you need. You don't have enough. You're not good enough. There's nothing you can do to change things. It's us versus them. Get them before they get you. There's no abundance. You don't have what you need. And I think that's a lie. And I think that if we learned the story that says you have what you need, and we practiced as if that story were true, gave it a year, our lives could be revolutionarily changed. Now, one of the things we need is other people. Most of all, what we need is a better story. I think we've probably all been through a hard time lately, these last few years. I don't know the story that you've lived through, and you don't know the story that I've lived through, but I think we can all assume each of us has faced things we didn't expect. And we've all certainly experienced something globally that we had no precedent for. But a friend of mine, an elder mentor, wisdom figure, Mahan Seiler, who is 87 or 88 years old, said to me not so long ago that his feeling was the main thing that privileged people have lost in the last few years is a sense of certainty about the future. And then he went on to say, what I mean is actually a false sense of certainty about the future. If you didn't already live with a lot of privilege, you never had a sense of certainty about the future anyway. And while that comes with its own pain and suffering, it's also a fast track to spiritual growth, because all the spiritual wisdom teachings that human beings have ever recorded agree on a small number of things. The first is to devote yourself to love and to love your neighbor as yourself. And another is, don't worry about tomorrow. Be in today. Does not mean tomorrow isn't going to have troubles. It's just meaning worrying about it isn't going to change those troubles. Now, if you're like me, you might have grown up hearing that teaching and feeling like you had yet another reason to feel inadequate, because I couldn't not worry about tomorrow. Worrying about tomorrow was just what I did. And so, having grown up with a lot of fear in my life, some of it at a kind of an almost like certainly a political level that sometimes felt cosmic, growing up in Northern Ireland in the midst of civil conflict, and sometimes at a tiny, tiny internal level that was only about me, or certainly only felt like it was about me. I had a lot of reason to worry, and that gave me a lot of reason to write this book, How Not to Be Afraid. The first thing I want to say about How Not to Be Afraid is that it's the wrong title. I chose the title and I like it, but it's the wrong title because it doesn't mean how to stop feeling fear. What it means is how to feel fear better. It's a little bit like the TV show What Not to Wear. That TV show did not prescribe that people should wear nothing. Fear is a natural, evolutionary reality in our bodies and actually protects us from time to time. So not only can we not stop being afraid, we shouldn't. We do need to learn if the story that's driving our fear is not true or is less true. And the antidote to a story that's not true is to find a true one, or a less true story is to find a more true one and get some of these things in perspective. How not to be afraid is really about how to be afraid well. And I won't sugarcoat your pain or mine tonight. I will try to tell you the truth. And if you're carrying something heavy coming in here this evening, and I don't mean that box of books, which is a heavy box of books. If you're carrying something heavy, maybe even something you're carrying just by yourself and you haven't told people about, I want to say that you're welcome here, whether you're in here or your magic Zoom land, you are welcome here. And I'm going to try to offer some comfort and hopefully some laughter too. We're not going to resolve all our fears tonight. I apologize if that's what you thought you were getting when you came in, but I hope we can find some shelter and maybe a smile and a sense of connection. How does that sound? Shall we do that? Okay, good. So a while back I was at a conference in a room a little bit like this. Actually, it was semicircular, but it had 3,000 people in it. It was a very large conference. It was taking place at a holiday camp just outside Dublin. Now, holiday camps in Ireland and Britain, you don't really have them in the US that I know of. They're places where families come for a cheap vacation. They stay in chalets or dorms, and there's usually a swimming pool with a water slide and activities for people to do. I guess they're a little bit like the family camps in the Catskills that I have seen in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, right? Good. So this one was at a place called Mosney that described itself as the Disney World of Ireland, and the accurate part of that terminology was that it was indeed in Ireland. We were there because a number of churches in Ireland had gotten together to have a conference that was promoting reconciliation across lines of division between Protestant and Catholic people in Ireland. We got to book this place because they made it available to us the week before their season began. You cannot book it during the summer. We booked it like early April, which meant, unbeknownst to us, that when we came into the rooms, it was all decorated for the summer season, which meant that this Christian Reconciliation Conference had its main stage speakers and worship services taking place in front of a backdrop dominated by a carved polystyrene mermaid. They hadn't been able to get a real mermaid. It's actually illegal to take a real mermaid out of the sea and put them on a stage. And I'm very glad. I don't mean it. That's a whole other story. They got a carved polystyrene one because the theme of this ballroom was enchantment under the sea, which is the theme of the prom night in Back to the Future. So I'm just wanting to make sure I'm using cultural references that at least a critical mass in the room can connect with. And for a week, we had very interesting talks about reconciliation. But on this particular night, something happened that I've never forgotten and has guided my life ever since. The speaker intended to start his talk with a joke by pretending that he wasn't telling a joke. He intended to pretend to be serious, and then there'd be a punchline at the end of this pretend seriousness. The joke was going to be that the most sinful member of the church in Ireland was in the room, and that God had told him that he was to expose that most sinful member tonight. And he whipped the crowd up into a bit of a frenzy. You've caused agony, you've destroyed churches, you've broken marriages, you've hurt even the most vulnerable among us. And what's worse, you know who you are, and you keep doing this because you are the most sinful member of the church in Ireland. And the only way to restrain you is if I identify you tonight and expose you in front of all these people. Now, there's 3,000 people in the room. I can see some of you are already looking uncomfortable, despite the fact that I'm telling you a funny story about something that happened in the past. I am not going to do this to you. Where he was going with this was his punchline was going to be, the name of the most sinful member of the church in Ireland is the tongue. Because in the King James Version of the Bible, the tongue is referred to as an unruly member. And then he was going to preach a sermon about the power of words to build up and to destroy. And the joke was intended as an icebreaker. And that would have been lovely had that been what occurred. What occurred was even better. He had not banked on the fact that this conference had childcare facilities, and if your child was in the childcare facilities, you had to sign them in and say where you were going to be. It was the days before cell phones, and so if your child needed you, they would just send one of the childcare helpers into the room where you were to go and get you. If you were in one of the small seminar rooms with 12 or 24 people in it, they would just interrupt the speaker and say, would so-and-so please come, your child needs you. But if you were in the 3,000-seater Enchantment Under the Sea mermaid room, they didn't want to interrupt the speaker. So instead what they did was they got a large piece of cardboard, a paintbrush, red paint the name of the parent on the piece of cardboard, and send 2 stewards in who would walk around the room like this, so as to not disrupt the speaker. And you already know exactly what happened. He said, and the name of the most sinful member of the church in Ireland is, and at exactly that moment, 2 stewards come in carrying a piece of cardboard on which is painted in big red letters the name of a parent in the room. They come around and a wave of sharp intakes of breath followed by an explosion of laughter occurs, and it just waves across the room. This woman who was a member of our church jumped out of her seat as if her feet were on industrial strength springs, ran out the back, don't worry. She was totally fine. I saw her the next day, and she said that she was only ever concerned for her daughter and was in such a blur, she wasn't embarrassed. And I think this is an interesting thing because, you know, you could call this a kind of a catastrophe, at least in the sense of it catastrophically ripped open the plans for the evening. But the catastrophe called forth the kind of love that has a mother run. And her daughter was fine, but that has a parent run. No matter, get out of my way, I am going to protect my child. That's what catastrophes call forth. It's not just look for the helpers, it's heroism gets called forth when society breaks. We find things within ourselves that weren't there before when society breaks. Back to the mermaid room. The speaker's laughing so hard that he literally falls down when trying to sit on the chair on the stage. He misses it, and he sits banging the floor, crying happy tears, and the proceedings are suspended for about 5 minutes while this eruption of laughter, and then calm, and then more laughter, and then calm, and then more laughter, and then calm. He tries to start the sermon again once a lull has come across the room. And he gets about a couple of sentences in before he breaks one more time. The whole room falls apart laughing. And they ended the service. It was impossible. And here's the thing. might be the most memorable talk I've never heard. It might be the most important message I've ever internalized, and the guy didn't even get to give it. Could someone get me water? Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Stories shape our lives. They shape our sense of the possible. They tell us who we are. They tell us where we've been. Usually, say it's until about 20 minutes into the talk before my voice gets cursed. What do you think of what I've said thus far? Just I might need another one of those. Thanks. We live by stories, but our culture doesn't teach us this. Our culture teaches us that what we believe is just true. I think human beings are all storytellers, from soup to nuts. Most of us are unconscious of this for most of our lives. But if the story is so powerful that it can lead us to act heroically or to live totally diminished lives, wouldn't it be important to get conscious about the story we're telling and to ask how true and how helpful that story is? Just as the catastrophe in that room in Dublin called forth love, it seems like today there's a lot of catastrophes to choose from. It feels like a dark time. Now, I think this word dark needs to be investigated. Other than the racist connotations of using the word dark to mean bad, and that's a problem in itself. It's also not accurate. Dark just means you can't see. Virginia Woolf, in 1915, a year into what became known as the First World War, wrote in a letter quoted by Rebecca Solnit in her amazing book, Hope in the Dark, that the future is dark, but she did not mean that the future is bad. She just meant, can't see around the next corner. It's really hard to tell. But you don't have to be in the middle of the First World War for that to be true. I don't know about any of you, but I can't see around the next corner without a dental mirror on a pole. No one can see around the next corner. The future's always dark. The question is, how can we learn to see in the dark? The Irish mystic philosopher John Moriarty wrote about coming home one night to his house on the coast with no artificial light to guide him. Parked his car, and the stars were astonishing. But more than that, the full moon, so bright white, it fully illuminated his walk up the path to his house. And when he got into the house, he was basking in the glow of the moon. He switched the light on so that he could see where he was going. And the moon disappeared. So he switched the light off again, and the moon reappeared coming through the window into his living room. And as an experiment, just to see what would happen, he switched the light on one more time, and lo and behold, no moon. So a final time, he switched the light off and sat down and looked at the moon over the ocean for hours, meditating on it and receiving the blessing that there are some things we can only see in the dark. So here's a blessing for seeing in the dark. No one can know your darkness like you can. And even you will not know it unless you face it. Strange, I know, to imagine facing something you cannot see. But there are things that can only be found in the dark. There is light that can only be seen in the dark. There may even be fragments or dimensions of love that will only touch you if you let them visit you in the dark. You are here not just to save the world, but to be changed. So may nighttime bring you in touch with memory, an examine of the day, with gratitude and learning, of the year, of your life and the 7 generations that brought you here, and with possibility, of the year, of your life and the 7 generations to come. May you wake from your dreams laughing and carry innocence becoming wonder wherever you go. May you tread lightly on the earth. Know that she belongs to you, and in her is your belonging too. Seeing in the dark. If we learn how to see in the dark, what we might find there is something wise that will guide us to a better story than the one that has so many of us living in unnecessary fear so much of the time. We might find that fear is totally natural. Fear evolved, people who know about these things believe, in response to threats that our prehistoric ancestors faced. The cliche is to say we were chased by saber-toothed tigers, and eventually one cave person finally realized, if you see a saber-toothed tiger coming, you should probably run, right? And these little things called the amygdalae formed in our brains in response to threat. They serve us today by telling us, don't walk out in front of traffic, or put your seatbelt on. The problem is they haven't evolved quickly enough to contend with the bombardment of stories in our culture that come at us thousands of times a day with no filter. These miraculous devices also have a cursed side, right? They are miraculous. They connect us in ways we've never been connected before. And there is a repository of all the written down knowledge that human beings have ever come up with that I can get by clicking a button. I mean, it'd be better to just buy this book, but clearly they have an upside, but the downside is the editorial control over the stories you read rests with you alone. And if, like me, you're a sensitive soul, you will see things that are pushed to you by electronic media publishing that depend on an economic model that has been called, if it bleeds, it leads. Now, I used to work for the BBC, and I know a lot of people of integrity who work within journalism, but it has taken on a life of its own. Even good people can't stop it. And the rest of us have to learn to filter it. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom is an ancient Hebrew idea. I was raised to kind of believe that what that meant was that God was this terrifying beast in the sky who was ready to kill you at a moment's notice if you didn't believe the right stuff. Now, it wasn't my parents who raised me that way. It was the culture I lived in. It was the cultural air I breathed. I don't think that that's what the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom means. I think it would be better translated as respect for reality is the beginning of wisdom. Respecting reality pushes us to ask ourselves how much of these stories are true. And where is my place in these stories? And what's the difference between an incident and a trend? Now, talking about if you are directly affected by something awful, and all of us have been directly affected by a number of awful things in our lives, that's different than talking about the general sense of what it is to be alive in the world on an ordinary day. If you're in crisis, I want you to have the support you need, and I will not diminish your experience of that crisis by telling you, well, the terrible thing that just happened to you, the good news is there's less of that happening generally. That's not a comfort if you're the person experiencing it. You know, if I stub my, I mean, this is a ridiculous analogy. If I stub my toe and you say, well, think about all the other people who didn't just stub their toes. That's not a pastorally sensitive thing to say. But I think we can agree that we don't judge fear and risk in proportion to their actual presence in the world. And fear and danger are not the same thing, right? And you know, and there are people who experience more danger than others. I'm talking about the fear that we receive the story with, and then what that fear does to us. Because it usually, at best, wastes our time. And at worst, it keeps us hiding, and it keeps us small, and it hides our light, and it forfeits from me the gift you could be giving to me right now, or the gift I could be giving to you. It's good news, actually, to step into the hypothesis that your brain and the media and your community story of fear are not an accurate picture of reality. And by the way, when I say the media, I mean any of us that has ever posted anything electronically. We are all part of the media. Clearly, some media is more powerful and therefore should be more accountable than others. But if you have a Facebook page, you're part of the media. I know someone back in Belfast who kind of illustrates this for me. She's brilliantly obsessively negative about everything you could possibly imagine to talk with her about, no matter what it is. Every response begins with, well, no. One day, it was a really beautiful sunny day where we were, and I saw her at the end of the day, and I said, it's a beautiful day, isn't it? And she said, well, I haven't seen any of it. I've been working, right? But it doesn't mean the day wasn't beautiful just because you didn't see it. I can be like that in terms of the way fear gets into me. I wonder, could we consider instead of allowing ourselves to be bombarded by stories being decided for us by other people who themselves are probably not wise? I wonder, could we instead imagine that we might have a role in co-creating and living a more truthful and more helpful story? Not a story that sugarcoats our pain, not a story that pretends pain isn't real, but a story that embodies transformation of that pain. Even if the transformation is limited only to sitting in the ashes and lamenting, that's a better story than having to suffer by yourself. But that's a better story that says you're suffering, you really need to get over that thing that happened to you, and feeling kind of pressure from people to speed up your recovery from something that nobody can decide for you, the timeline. What if we were called to play a role in co-creating and sharing a better story? Here's a better story. At the height of the apartheid era, Archbishop Tutu was speaking at an anti-apartheid rally in the Episcopal Cathedral in Cape Town. Has anybody visited that cathedral in Cape Town? Okay, just me, right. This is a famous story, and I have verified the details of this story with someone who heard it from Archbishop Tutu himself. The room was full of anti-apartheid activists. And then as the meeting got underway, a bunch of men came into the cathedral and lined the walls and started taking notes, and I think taking photographs of the people who were in the church. And this was members of the South African Secret Police trying to intimidate the anti-apartheid activists. And Archbishop Tutu's response was to come down out of the pulpit and go to the men who were seeking to intimidate the congregation and welcome them to the anti-apartheid rally. It's really great to see you. Thanks for coming. I didn't expect him to show up to an anti-apartheid rally. This is really encouraging. This is really encouraging. And then he went back to the pulpit and said, of course, I know you're not here for good reasons, but here's the thing. You can join this movement tonight. You can join this movement tonight. All you need to do is to take one step in from the wall. And if you do that, we will welcome you with open arms. And in fact, nothing you've done up till now will count against you, because we know that that one small step is actually a giant leap from where you're coming from, and you may have to leave your families. You certainly have to leave your job. But we'll welcome you and we will care for you. Just one step. Or you can stay where you are, and in a few years from now, when our victory is complete, all you will have is your shame. So in Easter 2005, I found myself in Cape Town. It was Maundy Thursday, the day before Good Friday, when it's traditional to give alms to the poor. And I wanted to go to visit this cathedral on Maundy Thursday, go to a mass there, because I'd known this story from Archbishop Tutu. I asked someone at the hostel reception I was staying at if it was safe to walk. They said, you're totally fine. And they were right. For the first 3 or 4 minutes of my walk, it was totally safe. But in the 5th minute, I was mugged by a young man who came up to me and initially asked me for money, and it was not a voluntary request. So I reached into my pocket. I did feel scared, and I gave him a coin that was worth about 50 cents. Then he opened his other hand and showed me a rusty box cutter knife and said, I don't want to stab you. Give me more money. Now, this was interesting because I didn't want him to stab me either. And I appreciated him announcing that. But usually people don't feel the need to tell people, hey, I'll have 2 tickets for the Avengers and I don't want to stab you. Honey, I'm not going to go any further down that road. I'd had enough mentoring from nonviolent storytelling activists and people who'd really put their lives on the line, that I had rehearsed stories of nonviolence in my mind and had easy recall for them. I don't mean that I was courageous. I just mean I had been listening to a lot of really good stories. They were there. Like learning another language, you recite it and you recite it and you recite it until it's second nature and it just comes out of you. So an image flashed into my mind that I should take my wallet out, give him a little bit more money, and say with authority, look, I'm late for church. And maybe that would kind of wake him up. And so I took a note out, I slammed it into his hand. That was the only act of physical force that happened on this particular day. I said, look, I'm late for church, and I stormed off down the street, indignant. I later found out that my father had been shot at in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, and that his response was indignation before it was fear. Being indignant at somebody abusing you is actually a sign of a healthy ego. How dare you? I'm a child of God. How dare you? You're a child of God. Why are you doing this? So I get about 2 minutes away from him and he doesn't pursue me. And I don't know if it's because I'd given him as much money as he wanted or if I had led to a radical turnaround in his life, but I didn't get much chance to think about it because I was mugged again by somebody else at that point. And after that one, I called a cab and decided not to walk any further. Now, I love South Africa. I was mugged twice in 2 minutes, but I was there for 2 weeks, and it was only those 2 minutes that I was being mugged. The rest of the time was magnificent, and I'm pretty privileged and pretty safe. It's a beautiful society that was going through a lot of challenges, just like mine, just like this one. The cab got me to the cathedral well in time for the mass, which meant I was the only person other than the ushers inside the building. If you've ever visited a big historic cathedral, it's usually full of tourists. And you usually wish that the tourists weren't there and pretend to yourself that you're not also a tourist. I got to sit in Cape Town Cathedral alone. First gift of that catastrophe. The second was that as I lifted up the order of service, my hands were shaking because I was going into shock. But as they stabilized, I was able to read. The liturgy was for Maundy Thursday, the day that alms are given to the poor. And while I don't think it's ever right to threaten someone with a knife, it was clear to me that that young man came from a place that I didn't come from. And one of the reasons I've never threatened anyone with a knife is because I never felt that I needed to. It's one of the reasons. And I can make informed assumptions that in the past, his ancestors were treated very differently by my ancestors. And our relationship didn't begin the night that we met on the street. The following week, I was back in Belfast and Pope John Paul II died. Some anti-Catholic graffiti went up in Belfast. And a friend of mine called me up and said, "You need to do something about this." I said, "Well, what about you?" and she said, "Because I think it's your job." And I called a couple of friends up and we saw this piece of graffiti. It was on the wall of a supermarket parking lot and it said, "Where the F is the Pope now? Ha, ha." It was just venomous, anti-Catholic. And it could just as easily have been anti-Protestant graffiti if it had been somebody else who died. Our society has been so broken for so long on those ethno-religious grounds, and we are transforming that, and we are learning to collaborate. But on this particular night, someone had gone out and decided to rub people's grief in their faces. So at 4 o'clock the next morning, we went out with a bucket of paint, no mermaid. Forgot to bring a paintbrush, which would have been smart. So as I was leaving the house, I took a bathroom sponge. We prayed the Lord's Prayer. We read the passage from Isaiah about turning swords into plowshares. We walked over to this piece of graffiti that said, "Where the F is the Pope now, ha, ha," and wrote 5 words on top of that graffiti so that you could see what was underneath it, but that it was being transcended by the single least used and perhaps most important word, and that is sorry. And we wrote it 5 times. Sorry, 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 sorry. It did not feel brave. It felt exciting. It didn't feel scary, except for the couple of minutes when the milk delivery float drove past us. Now, those were the original electric vehicles, and they couldn't go any more than 30 miles an hour. And this guy's out delivering milk in the middle of the night, and he's driving past us, and he slows down to about 20 miles an hour, and he's watching us putting paint. He thinks we're graffiti. I mean, we were doing graffiti ourselves, and he's like slowing down, and we're like, the milk delivery guy's going to chase us in his 20-mile-an-hour electric vehicle, and we figured we could outrun the car. So we were all right. We went home and we had a cup of tea and bacon sandwiches as the sun came up, and we felt really good. You know, I don't deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, but it felt really good. It felt really good to see a problem and then to do something about it there and then. How about that? No big strategy meetings, no long-term plans. It's just, this is the right thing to do right now. And sometimes you know the right thing to do right now. You just got to do it. We didn't tell too many people about it, but it still made the evening news. And then it was on the second page of the main Protestant newspaper the next day, being held up as, I'm wondering if this is either investigative journalists or Secret Service representatives from Northern Ireland in 2005 who've been tracking me for 18 years. I think there's a statute of limitations on graffiti. it was in the main Protestant newspaper and being held up as something positive, which was amazing. And best of all, later that week, I met a community worker who told me that they had been at a meeting with leaders, some of whom had been involved in paramilitary organizations on the Protestant side of the community, one of whose leaders had told them, I don't know who painted out that graffiti, but I'm glad they did, because my journey to prison began with me writing anti-Catholic graffiti. And he knew it was probably teenage boys in his community that had done that. And he wanted that to be intervened with. We didn't know any of those things were going to happen. We just saw offensive, venal graffiti, and we felt that we had some responsibility for it because we would be perceived as being from the same community that put the graffiti up. I don't know how Desmond Tutu found the courage to do what he did. And writing out a wee bit of graffiti in Belfast is nothing compared with what the anti-apartheid movement had to contend with, but it is still on the same continuum. You know, it's at the extremely easy end of activism, but it is activism for a better world that at least sacrificed our sleep. And frankly, it took a long time to get the white paint that was up to my elbow, because it turns out you have to dip a sponge right into the paintbrush into the paint tin when you don't have a paintbrush. I don't know how he found the courage specifically. I never got to ask him, but I have found everyone I know who has done such a thing, everyone I know who has done a transformative thing in which they have faced something fearful and have turned the story into something courageous. Everyone I know who's done that has found the inner resource to do so through two practices that cannot be ignored. One is to breathe more slowly, even for just 1 minute a day. Some people call it meditation, some people call it prayer. Neither can be done without slowing down our breathing. And the second is to connect with a small group of people who are committed to the journey of spiritual maturity. People who want to grow up into what it is to be a full human being. People who want to live in service to the needs around us. And also people who are willing to ask for their needs to be met too. Even if we don't get the need met, sometimes just asking is half the battle. Two practices, breathing and connecting. We're going to pause here and have an opportunity to have a little discussion at our tables and in small groups on Zoom. And I'm going to ask you to reflect on two really simple questions and then two slightly less simple questions. Okay. These four questions form the heart of what we call porch circles. And these are gatherings that we have of between 3 and 8 people, where we meet. Brian and I are in a group that's been meeting once a week for 5 or 6 years, and we just ask these 4 questions. They are variations on the time-honored and almost completely useless question that you've all been asked multiple times today, and you've probably all asked multiple times today. And that question is, how are you? Okay. These questions actually help us arrive at a meaningful answer. And if you'd like to write them down, that would be great. They're not long questions. So instead of how are you, question 1 is, what's something life-giving to you? And it can be like throughout your life, or it can be today, or it can be in the last week, something life-giving to you. The second question, what's something that's not life-giving to you? Again, in your whole life, or today, or the past week. To me, those are much more helpful than how are you doing? The third question, what is one headline of a better story you would like to live? Now, I'll give you an example of a story that isn't a better story. Us versus them. that's a story that isn't a better story. The myth of redemptive violence, which is the idea that we will bring order out of chaos through blowing things up, that's a story that isn't a better story. There's nothing I can do to change things. That's another story. And you have your own variations of this. I'm broken forever. That's a story a lot of people hold. So what's one headline of a better story you would like to live? None of these questions are tests, by the way. They're just invitations. And then the fourth question is, having heard the answers from the other people in your little group, is there anybody who wants to offer a piece of help to someone else in the group? You don't have to receive or accept this help. Or is there anybody that wants to ask for some help? And I'll give you an example, a couple of examples. Sometimes in our circle, it's been as simple as, I need a babysitter this week and I can't afford to pay for one. It can be as profound as, I'm having an existential crisis. I don't believe in anything anymore, and I need someone to go for a walk with me every Saturday morning for the rest of my life. A good response to that would be, how about we try 2 Saturdays and see how far we get with that. We can review it after 2 Saturdays. A third example in our group, someone very close to me had a sudden bereavement, and for many months wanted the support of our group to just talk about Dawn and how much Dawn meant to him. It was simple. And it can get really radical, and when groups meet over a longer period of time, someone might find themselves saying, I can't afford my rent. Could this group carry me? And I don't just mean this week. I mean, I really need 3 months to get on my feet. And it wouldn't be done in a capitalist top-down way. There'd be an exchange, it just wouldn't be monetary. The group might decide, yeah, we can help you with your rent, and call forth your gifts that may not be monetary right now, so we don't shame each other. Because all of us have needs, no matter what we've got in the bank, and all of us have gifts, no matter how little we have in the bank. So that's the fourth question. Once you've heard everybody else, is there some piece of help you'd like to offer, knowing that the person does not have to receive this help? And it could be hypothetical. You might say, well, I think the kind of help that it would be good to offer you would be. And we're just experimenting with this tonight. And the other question is, if you want to ask for a piece of help. And what we'll do is we'll spend 15 minutes. I think is 3 people to a group okay, Wendy? Does that make sense to you? Or what have you got set up on the Zoom? Okay, great. So we'll do them in groups of 3 here. And the reason for that, if it's larger than 3, it'll take too long for everybody to answer. And the idea is everybody in the group is given the opportunity to answer question 1. And it's just one sentence. It's just one sentence. Something I find life-giving is. Then everybody gets the chance to answer question 2. Then everybody gets the chance to answer question 3. And then the whole group responds to question 4. Again, it's not a test. No one's going to get into trouble. You'll have the opportunity to share a thought or 2 with the group again. No one will be required to speak, and you don't have to respond to any of the questions. But please, in this room, keep it to 3 people in the group. Otherwise, people won't have the chance to speak. Does anybody have a question of me before you go into that? Yes?
I want to apologize because there's a few of us that
Have to leave for your, yeah. Can you do it with noise, storming out and making it look like a protest walkout? Because I've never had one of those. Good. Good. If everybody leaves, I'll know that you're not all going to the same place. So we'll do this for 15 minutes, and then we'll be back for another 20-minute wrap up, some storytelling, and we'll have some conversation. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
So Eliasine was giving me the great gift of something life-giving by telling me that I should tell you all that this book is available tonight and in one random copy there's a ticket for a better book. So that's one way to do it. The Life and Times of Eliasin Rosario Cruz. Are you going to write that book? You should write that book. The Life and Times of Eliasin. I'd read that. I'd read that. So welcome back, and welcome back, Zoom friends. I'd really just like to ask for one or two, if there's something that emerged for you that you feel it would be useful for the rest of the group to hear. Not telling somebody else's story, but just anything that came up for you that you feel would be useful for the rest of the group to hear. And sometimes that doesn't happen, but if you haven't, would you raise your hand and a microphone will come to you from Eliasin. Thank you.
I think I was just so surprised at how those questions really unveil truth and authenticity. I think so much of the "how are you" question is just an orientation to our day. And I always leave so unsatisfied with that question when I answer it, and then when I hear it in other people, because it stays so surface. And I was just really amazed at how these questions provided specific invitations for people to really share things that we may never have gotten to in a million "how are yous." And so I really thank you for that. It was a gift.
Thank you. Well, you've St. Ignatius to thank for the first two questions, because they're just variations on the spiritual exercises. And the question, the elegant way of asking the question is, what are some sources of consolation in your life, and what are some sources of desolation? But I found lately, like, there's two things about these four questions, the way they work. One is they have no innate religious baggage, and so anybody can ask them. And it's helpful if you do. I mean, lots of people, I don't want to say lots, there's a number of people have formed little porch circles as a result of reading about them in the book or hearing about them from some of the people in our community. And they're just one method of doing things, but they have been very life-giving for people over time. And if you do form a circle, it's really good to agree a time limit on each question. It can be like 3 minutes per person or 1 minute per person. And you do like the formal questions for 40 minutes, and then everybody just kind of shoots the breeze. But lately I've been saying to people, I think I said this to a hairdresser the other day, instead of asking, "how are you?" which is really just another version of hello, tell me something good, tell me something tough, and tell me the next thing that comes into your mind, right? So if you said, try it next time you're in an elevator with a stranger, don't do that.
How therapy helps with fear.
Yeah, you're framing that as a question or
As a statement.
Yeah. Well, say a little bit more. Would you say a sentence or two more about what?
Well, I've used it to deal with issues that happened in Vietnam.
Thank you. And so the circles we just did are about kind of peer-to-peer support, although nobody is a peer of anybody, actually. Nobody is a peer of anybody. Everybody has something that nobody else has. And everybody's struggling with something that maybe nobody else is struggling with, at least in the specifics. And it's nice to have balanced groups like that, because there'll be someone who can say, "I've dealt with this before and I can help you," or "I'm not struggling with that burden right now, so maybe I'm exactly the person to help you." And therapists and spiritual directors and shamans and medicine people and elder wisdom figures are fundamentally necessary as part of the health of our lives. I've benefited from many. Yes.
I think to that point, and what you said at the beginning of the talk about being someone who's don't think about that, and being someone who innately fears, right? The notion of these questions just being safety.
Yeah.
Deep spiritual soul, physical safety in such a short time. Beautiful.
Oh, I'm so
Thank
glad.
you.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad to hear that. All right. And is there anyone on Zoom, Wendy, that's typed anything that you want to read out? Masterpiece is spelled So
Amelia? I think Amelia, you have your hand is raised. So just unmute yourself and
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think for our group, I would just say that it was interesting to me that we had such a common theme. And we all had a very similar, came around in a full circle almost of a very common theme from all three of us together. And that felt really great for me in terms of just a nice connection with the group that I was in.
great. Lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I invite you to experiment with these questions. They do help. They do help. And I know so many people, there's suffering, there's necessary suffering, and there's inevitable suffering. And then there's unnecessary suffering and suffering that is not inevitable. I think a lot of the time we can choose to do something about the latter two, the unnecessary and non-inevitable suffering. And a lot of that has to do with structures of injustice in our society, and we're not going to overcome them overnight, but we can help. We can help. I think fear is a doorway. And I think that if we can slow down our breathing and form communities of people who are all searching for spiritual maturity and what it is to be fully human, whatever fears beset you can become a portal. This book looks at 7 fears in particular. And I'm going to say one sentence about each of them so that you don't have to read the book. But I'm told it is a marvelous cure for insomnia. And if you have a shaky lectern like this, you put it underneath one of the things and stabilize it. Both very good uses for a book. If you are afraid of being alone, that story could become an opportunity for you to transform your lonely story by befriending yourself. People who have befriended themselves are not lonely, either because they become deep mystics and they don't need to be in touch with other people, or they become the most popular person in the room because everybody's like, they really love themselves and I want a piece of that. If you're afraid that you've done something that can't be fixed, well, join the club. Every sensitive person believes at some level, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, or I hurt that person. And maybe you can make amends. Often amends of that kind just aren't possible, or it might hurt the other person. Instead, your story could be one of how you transformed this mistake or misdeed and decided you're not going to do that again. And instead, you're going to become the person who loves the most, the person who's the humblest, the person who's the most down to earth, the person who's the least judgmental, because you know you need that mercy for yourself. If you fear having a meaningless life, it could be an invitation for an intervention in your own soul to discern a mission of service at the intersection of where your great passion and where the world's great needs lie, and then make your own meaningful life through the little mustard seed that you can bring to the world. I've been thinking a lot lately about what people call the myth of greatness, which is a driving myth in our society. It basically says we should all pursue this thing called greatness. And then greatness is defined in terms of money and power. And the problem with that is, for me to be great through having more money and power means you need to have less of it. So actually, greatness requires me to trample on other people on the way up the tree. There can only be so many best-selling books. I know so many writers whose books are worthy of being New York Times bestsellers because of the meaning and passion and substance of the book. But it's all a game of chance whether or not something gets noticed by large numbers of people. And that is not equal to the value of the work. We're all painting ducks on 3-cent stamps. And if you are passionate about the movie Fargo, you know what I mean. And if you're not passionate about the movie Fargo, it simply means we might all be entering the competition to get our painting on the 60-cent stamp. But the vast majority of us are going to get it on the 3-cent stamp, and we need to validate each other's 3-cent stamp. Because your 3-cent stamp is worth the crown jewels if it is the thing you're called to do. And the people who get the 60-cent stamp, frankly, it's always a matter of chance. Or tragedy, actually. Some people get really popular when something awful happens in their lives. And some really popular people end up getting assassinated. So there's a lot of downsides to fame and success and the myth of greatness. The biggest downside about the myth of greatness is it tells the rest of us that our stamp isn't worth anything. I'm in a room full of people with a diamond crown jewels 3-cent stamp in your hand. And I need you to use it, and you need me to use mine. Not just so the world can function, but so that humanity can flourish. There's a reason why spiritual gifts in the New Testament, in the list of spiritual gifts, the gift of encouragement and the gift of hospitality is on the same list as the gift of miracles. It's all the same. If you're bringing the fullness of the gift that you've been given, you might as well be raising people from the dead. So if you fear having a meaningless life, consider the 3-cent stamp that you have. If you fear not having enough, that might be an invitation to discover your own abundant gifts and to share them generously with others, especially if they're not monetary gifts. We have to overcome this nonsense that it's the amount of money you have in the bank that defines the value of what you bring. I love it when people give me used books that they have owned and they're not going to use anymore. I love because I feel them in it. You know, it's actually more thoughtful than just going on to Amazon and getting a new book. I get royalties from the new book. I don't get royalties from the used book. I don't really care. I kind of do care. But that's like, I'm not fully sanctified yet. But if you share your gifts generously with others, you'll watch your sense of scarcity reverse itself. If you fear that you'll be broken forever, maybe that would be an invitation to imagine what the wisest person you can think of would say to you about you. Not the most angry person or the most judgmental person or the self-directed loathing that each of us has a little bit of, but what would the wisest person that you know say to you about your fear that you'll be broken forever? If you fear the world, well, you're just like every human that's ever lived. Each generation has its own reasons to feel afraid. And each generation is called to do what Margaret Mead said is the only thing that has ever changed the world, which is that a small group of committed citizens acting together compassionately is the only thing that has changed the world. And it'll be what our descendants do many generations from now. And they look back at us and are grateful for the things that we overcame in our moment so that they didn't have to handle them, just like our ancestors have done for us. And finally, if you fear death, that might be an invitation to really face the fear of death for what it really is. And that is the root of all fear, the fear of death. And as you face the fear of death, it might be an invitation to ask what you could see in the dark. Because there was a time when the dark was the only thing you could see. The people on Zoom can't see me if I go over there. Wow, here we go. Wow. It's weird, the camera's doing like, camera's making me dizzy. It's like a grandfather clock pendulum. Okay. Can people on Zoom, would you like to move with me for a moment? Because like, there you go, somebody, thank you. I love it. Thank you. There was a time when the only thing you could see was dark. There was a time when you were bathed in warm fluid. You were inside a cave that was totally safe. In fact, you had no sense of the possibility of there being anything other than safety. Because you had no concept of time. There was no yesterday, there was no tomorrow. You were just floating in this cave, this warm water. If you had really enlightened people thinking about you, they might sometimes have played a little bit of classical music or the Commodores. And you didn't know the difference between Philip Glass and Lionel Richie, but you liked them both, as all right-thinking people do. Security was all you knew. And then, one day, the first day, you became aware of the fact that there were things called days. The water flooded out of this cave with no warning whatsoever. And you were thrust down a tunnel, being squeezed and suffocated. Can you imagine learning of the concept of suffocation simply by having it done to you? Some of you, actually, it was even more radical than that. The roof of the cave was ripped open. And these large things that you didn't know were hands came in and tore you out of the cave. For the rest of us, you pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And just at the point where you couldn't breathe anymore, you were, as my friend John O'Donoghue would say, expelled out into merciless light. Where these giants dressed in green, the first time you'd known there was such a thing as colors, these giants dressed in green picked you up. And the first thing they did was to cut the connection between you and the cave of ultimate safety. Do you remember the first sound you made? Do you? Do you? You do. What did it sound like? Exactly. The first noise you made was to wail. You had been taken out of the safety zone. And every day you've lived since then has been outside the safety zone. So if you got to here, you've been living with insecurity your whole life. Your whole life. There's a lovely tradition that I learned from a rabbi that if you slow down your breathing and you make a sound with your breathing, sound sounds like the Hebrew name for God. And as I understand it from this rabbi, one way of looking at the teaching in the Hebrew Bible that says, do not speak the name of God, might actually be, don't confuse theology with the experience of love. Theology is great. Psychology is great. Don't confuse them with the experience of love. You can't not say the name of God as long as you're breathing. If we slow down our breathing, we'd actually be getting in touch with the God, which is love. Our birth was like dying. It must, if we were really conscious, John would also say, like, if you'd been able to like get a walkie-talkie into the womb, communicate with this baby, you know, a couple of weeks before term, and said, here, listen, in a couple of weeks, your home is going to be destroyed. And you're going to be expelled from it. And for the rest of conscious time on earth, you are never going to know what's around the next corner. You need to sign this release. The baby might have said, listen, can I talk to are there any baby lawyers around? Can we renegotiate? Can we get an extension on the deadline? And I know that for some people, their birth was traumatic. And I know that for some people, birth stories are very painful. And I want to speak sensitively if that's your story too. The metaphor means something different tonight. And that is, you're here because you've already died. If you're afraid of death, you have evidence that it may actually be okay to die again. And that maybe death isn't what you think it is. That maybe the consciousness of death that we can have now can push us toward living not fear-free lives, but fearless or fear-reduced, or getting fear in healthy proportion. Last thing I'll say before we have a few more questions, if you have them, is there's a movie out at the moment called Living. It's a wonderful movie, and it's a remake of a Japanese film from 1952 called Ikiru by Akira Kurosawa, and it's about a man in Japan who works a kind of a really soul-deadening bureaucratic job, and he gets a terminal diagnosis, 6 months to live, and decides not to tell anybody. Looks for love from his family, but he doesn't get it from them. Goes into kind of hedonism and sees, if I'll just live it up, but that doesn't make him happy either. And so what he ultimately decides to do with these remaining months is a thing he's just never done before. He's going to build a children's playground. And the film follows him as he does things like he needs to get zoning permission from the city council and so on and so forth. And there's an organized crime boss who is threatening him. And there's a moment in the film when he comes face to face with this organized crime boss, like a mafia guy, like someone who really could kill him. And Mr. Watanabe, the lead character in this film, when he's confronted by the organized crime boss, just laughs in his face. What are you going to do to me? What are you going to do to me now, 6 months, 60 years? You know, I think we can safely assume within 75 years of this date, all of us will have found out what comes next. It's going to happen. What would it be like to laugh in the face of the fear of death while taking death seriously? And instead of having the living death that comes from walking around, always trying to paint in between the lines, always trying to make sure we get it right, always trying to clean up the past. Instead of doing that, we just laughed. We just laughed and loved each other through the laughter. Thank you for spending this time with me this evening. I'd love to have a little more conversation. If there's anything else you'd like to say or ask, and whether you do or not, I want to say that, you know, the myth of greatness applies to the publishing of books as well. You know, there's arbitrary decisions get made about which books get attention, how much they should cost, and things like that. And I have learned with deep gratitude and honor from amazing mentors that the amount of money that you have and that you have available to pay for a book is not a mark of your character, and it's also not a mark of the value of the book. So this book is here as my gift to anybody that wants to experience it and be in conversation with it. And if the resources that you have available tonight don't extend to you being able to pay for a book, I'd like you to have it as a gift. If you can pay the cover price, it's $24.99. If you need to pay less than that, that's totally fine too. And if you can pay more, it helps enable me to share it with people for whatever they can afford. But I really do mean it. All I want in exchange for the book, in addition to whatever you can pay from $0 to 50,000, if you really want, nobody's paid $50,000 for a copy of this book yet. It could happen. The main thing I want in exchange is a handshake and a word of hello between us. And Wendy has told me that people on Zoom, you can also pay for it. Again, paying $24.99 or whatever amount through a PayPal link that Wendy's going to put up there, and the books will be available here for you to collect. So I learned that from other people. It's just part of keeping this like a community rather than a sales pitch. And if you're artists or writers, I encourage you to experiment with this too. Generosity mirrors itself. So are there more questions or comments? Go on. We can have like a minute of awkward silence if you want. But
That was my question, is how do those of us who are on Zoom, how are we able to get a book?
so
And I don't live in Seattle.
right. So it's you can come to my house in Asheville, North Carolina,
Okay.
or you can get it in the usual outlets. And you know, all the online booksellers, whichever one you prefer.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for asking. Thank you for asking. So if you feel bad for me because that lovely person on Zoom can't buy one tonight, you should be first in line. So.
Wayne, you have a comment or a question? Oh, never mind, Wayne. I got the wrong information.
I think there was a question down here. Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you. I just, in my own story, I keep being told to tell my story. So thank you.
Thank you.
Message received.
Over here. And if you can just wait for the microphone, because then the folks on Zoom can hear, unless you're going to say something critical.
I wanted you to clarify something in your story that
Yeah.
you told about the scribbling about the Pope's death.
Yeah.
And you wrote sorry 5 times over it. And I'm not from your culture.
Yeah.
And I don't know your background or the history. So I can imagine who that sorry could have been to.
Yeah.
Or what it could have meant, but I don't know. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit of what you felt you were writing and to whom.
Thank you for the question and opportunity to clarify. So, you know, I have a very mixed background in Ireland: Protestant, Catholic, Northern Irish, Southern Irish, English, Scottish, and Eastern European Jewish is the heritage that I'm aware of. But you know, that graffiti was put up by Protestants who were targeting Catholics with the graffiti. And because I would be perceived by many people to be from the Protestant community, even though it's more complicated than that, I certainly carried well, there's complex dynamics about who has privilege in Northern Ireland, but I carried some Protestant privilege. We felt, okay, I'm not going to throw these kids under the bus and scapegoat them. Because again, one of the reasons that I haven't written anti-Catholic graffiti in my time is because that didn't happen in my neighborhood, you know, and I lived in that neighborhood through economic privilege and some other reasons too. So we were saying sorry as people who had Protestant privilege. And this doesn't represent us, you know. And I had an experience only yesterday when an individual, upon hearing a story of a painful thing that had happened in my life that he was becoming aware of for the first time and had played no role in, he did a beautiful thing. We were out for a walk and he stopped me and he said, "It's not even my place to do this, but I want to apologize to you for that happening." And that was, I mean, it wasn't his place to be, he hadn't done it, but gosh, it touched me so deeply. And I said to him, "You don't need to apologize." He's like, "I know, but I'm still sorry that happened." And sometimes that can go a long way. Does that respond to your question? Thank you. Thank you. Are there one or two more? Because if there aren't, I'll assume that I've just told you everything you needed to know. That's not true. So. Anyone else in Zoom, Wendy? Oh yeah. An official holy person.
Would you be willing to share a headline that you're living into?
Yeah, I would be willing to share a headline that I'm living into, and I've already named it in some ways that like, I want to overcome and help people overcome the myth of greatness through validating everybody's 3-cent stamp. And so that's the story, that's part of the story I want to live into. And I'll name part of that is because there's pain in me around feelings of I haven't succeeded or I've failed, you know, and that can keep you I'll share this because it might be helpful to someone. I had a dream last year where I was in a stainless steel room that had a door that appeared to be locked. And I was in the corner of the room with my head like this. And in the dream, it seemed like I'd been there for decades. And above the door was a neon sign that was green and spelled out the word envy. And periodically, I would get up from the corner of the room and I would run at the door and ram it with my head to see if I could break down the door and escape from the room of envy. But I couldn't. It would just knock me back down into the corner, and I'd be in the corner then for more years. And I'd get up and ram the door again, but it wouldn't work. And then eventually something happened. I'm imagining in the dream I slowed down my breathing and found some spiritually mature people to talk to. Where I looked up and I noticed that the door had a handle all along. And so I just walked to it with purpose and I turned the handle, and lo and behold, it wasn't locked. And I opened the door and I walked out of the room of envy. And when I walked out of the room of envy, I was in my paradise. And my paradise is not no work. It includes vocation. It was that there was this clear path to what I'm here for. And that envy can trap us into, why don't I have what they have? Or why am I not more like them? But if you stand up, and you maybe need to spend a bit of time in the room of envy just to feel it. And for me, like, it's a double burden, because I feel the envy and then I feel shame for feeling the envy, and then I feel stupid for, why am I feeling this envy again? You know? And I think, this is not unique, it's not unique to me. This is something a lot of us feel. If you walk out of the room of envy, you might find a clear path to the thing you're called to, which might actually look a little bit like the thing that you envied in the other person, but it won't be external things like how many people like them, or they're popular, or they sell more books or whatever. It'll be more like there's a sacred spark on the inside of the thing you're looking at and going, I want to do that amount of good in the world, or I want to help people feel the way they make them feel. But the thing is, you will never make them feel the way they make them feel, because you're not supposed to. You're supposed to make them feel the way you make them feel. You're supposed to bring them the gift that only you can bring. And if you woke up tomorrow in one of those body swap comedies and you suddenly had the life, if I had the life of George Clooney, which is not that dissimilar from the life I actually do have, let's face it, I would be a malfunctioning Clooney, and he'd be a malfunctioning Gareth. He can only be the most him. I can only be the most me. So that's where the 3-cent stamp thing really came back into my consciousness later around, oh man, I would so much prefer to be in a community of people where everybody's saying, show me your 3-cent stamp, show me your 3-cent stamp, show me your 3-cent stamp. And every now and again, somebody gets a bigger light shown on them, and they have a responsibility to kind of get a mirror out and reflect it back on other people and say, let's all keep going. Let's all keep going together. Sometimes we sit in the ashes. Sometimes we have big victories. Sometimes hope comes in moments, and sometimes even there are days, whole days, where we might feel hopeful, and then it goes away again, the pendulum swings. So, but the headline is, I want to overcome the myth of greatness by sharing my 3-cent stamp and encouraging you all to share yours too. Thank you for the question. It's a lovely question.
Friends.
Oh, the guillotine comes down.
The guillotine. You can stay, as you can say, you can stay for a long time having a great conversation, and you're invited to. But for those of you at home that need to get going, those of you here that need to get going, please help me saying thank you to Gareth for the gifts that we have received today. Let us close with the prayer. Holy One, thank you for the gift of stories, for inspiration, for the 3-cent stamp that we all carry. Grant us wisdom to cherish it, to value it, to share with others, to recognize the gift in others and the beautiful story of being beloved. Be with Gareth as he continues sharing these stories of wisdom with others. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen.